0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. Let's crack on with our first question. It's Jay in St Ives. Jay, what would you like to ask?
Hi, Ian. Good evening, panel. Does the panel think that the West has fallen into the bear trap by the bear?
Oh, what kind of bear trap are you meaning?
So, what I mean is Mr. President Putin, whatever you call him, has got a wane. His popularity was waning in Russia, economically and politically, after COVID. And what he needed to do is just to distract and gain popularity within his nation. Okay, and we have fallen into that.
Peter Ricketts, have we fallen into a bear trap?
No, I don't think we have, and I don't really accept the idea that President Putin is some great strategist. I think he's an opportunist. And actually, I don't think a war in Ukraine is popular in Russia. I don't think public opinion's been prepared for it, and I think a lot of people would say, why are we fighting fellow Slavs across the border? I'm afraid President Putin has got himself into a sort of visceral nationalist mindset where NATO is the enemy, and the answer is a ring of buffer states around Russia, all of them weak or pro-Russian or at least neutral, and he is determined, as part of his legacy, to leave Ukraine in that state. And he's seen an opportunity. He thinks the West is weak or distracted. I think perhaps he's been a bit surprised by the strength of the Western reaction so far. And the rest is doing the right thing to stand up to him. So no, I don't think it's a bear trap. I think he's backed himself into a corner and he's got some quite difficult choices to make now.
Why do you think the West let this get into this situation? I mean, why did he... You said that, well, he's seen an opportunity. Why has the West given him that opportunity?
Well, I think he assumed that President Biden was distracted and very much focused on China, that Britain was rather off the air with its post-Brexit psychodramas. The other Europeans was a new German leader. Macron was facing elections. It was a period where the West was diversified and not really focused on Russia. He's certainly got the West's attention on Russia now, but he's also pulled NATO together in a way that hasn't been true for years. He's brought NATO troops closer to Russia as we reinforce our allies, and he now is facing some very serious sanctions. I hope they can become more serious.
Has he brought NATO together, though? Because certainly in the initial weeks of this, Germany and France seem to be at odds with certainly most of the rest of NATO. And even though you've got EU sanctions stronger than the ones that Britain has imposed so far, I wonder whether NATO is that united.
Well, I think it is more united than it has been for a long time. It's been pursuing a kind of double-track strategy. One, diplomacy, the other, deterrence. And the British and the Americans have been more on the deterrence track. It's true France and Germany have been really trying hard in the diplomacy track to give Putin every last chance to take a negotiated solution rather than the recklessness of war. But those two have been coordinated. I don't think that the French and Germans were wrong to be pursuing that. Now Putin has crossed the line and is using force against Ukraine. I think NATO comes together. The Germans have taken a big step in suspending their Nord Stream 2 pipeline with the Russians. And a lot of NATO member states have reinforced their allies with troops and equipment. So I think against a test like this, an open threat of invasion in Europe, NATO will be united.
Nick Thomas-Symonds, Labour has been almost as bullish, in fact sometimes more bullish than the Prime Minister on this so far, certainly in terms of sanctions, and yet there's a significant section of the Labour Party that would be supporters of the so-called Stop the War coalition. It's quite difficult for any political party, and I'll ask Mark the same question in a moment, to be completely united on a subject like this, isn't it?
I don't accept the significant section description, and I think that we've had a very, very clear and strong policy on this, and we've stood united across the House of Commons on standing up to Russian aggression, and secondly, standing up for the sovereignty of Ukraine. And we've been absolutely clear in doing that. And whilst, of course, we are saying very much that the sanctions should go further, we are also saying to the government, Bring those proposals forward and we will support them. You will not find in Parliament the opposition frustrating those additional sanctions. We say bring them forward now and they will have our support.
But there are, I think, 13 Labour MPs that have signed the Stop the War Coalition statement saying it's all Britain's and the West's fault, nothing to do with Russia, blah, blah, blah. I mean, OK, it's only 13, but 13 out of, 208 or something like that? I can't remember the exact number. I mean, that's quite a loud and vocal minority, and some very senior, Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell, Diane Abbott, John Trickett, senior names in amongst those. Should, as Boris Johnson suggested today, should they have the whip withdrawn?
Well, look, I don't think it's appropriate for me to comment on, parliamentary colleagues losing the whip, and there's obviously a process.
Why not?
For that.
You must have a view.
No, I don't think it's appropriate for me to do that. That's a matter for the Chief Whip, and there's a specific process for that, and quite rightly too, because it's a quite pretty profound, serious thing to lose the whip. But the front bench position of the Labour Party is extremely clear on this. And by the way, it has historic roots. I'm very proud of Clement Attlee's Labour government, very proud of the National Health Service, but very proud as well of what that government did in 1949 to establish NATO. So our support
Ernest
for
Bevin
NATO
was a key part in that. As a Labour historian, you know better than me.
Absolutely. Ernest Bevin, as Foreign Secretary, was central to that treaty being signed in 1949. So Labour's commitment to NATO is unshakable, and it has deep historic roots in our party as well.
Mark Harper, let's come to you on this, because, of course, when the Iraq War happened, there was a bit of a split in the Tory party. You had quite a few MPs opposing it. John Barron is the one that springs to mind, but there were plenty of others too. How united is your party on the approach that the government is taking?
Well, I think very united, actually. I think in terms of the direction of travel, you had some voices yesterday who reflect, I think, some of what Peter said, that they'd want things to go a bit faster. But one of the difficulties here is about trying to make sure we move in lockstep with our partners. So one of the things with the sanctions is making sure that we and the Americans and our EU partners are doing the same things at the same time, particularly on financial sanctions, because otherwise you just move money around the world. So it's making sure, and it's also making sure you do it properly. If you're sanctioning very wealthy oligarchs who have very expensive lawyers, you do have to make sure you do it properly, and it's better to get it right.
Well, I agree with that, but there is a problem here, though, because, Layla Moran, Susan's colleague, named, I think, 35 different oligarchs that she thinks should be sanctioned. I've got no idea sort of the veracity of that or whatever. But the longer you leave it before you do sanction them, you just said it yourself, they can move their money out of the country and then the sanctions won't be very effective.
No, which is exactly why speculating about individuals and what she might do is not actually very helpful. I'm very clear from having listened to both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary that what we set out yesterday was an initial set of sanctions in response to Putin recognising and treating as independent countries those parts of Ukraine and threatening Ukraine's sovereignty. If we see Russian troops crossing into Ukraine, then there will be another raft of sanctions, very significant ones, agreed by our G7 partners, and that will really step up the pain on Putin and those people that surround him. So, and as Nick said, and I think we very much welcome the support, it's very powerful that all of the parties in the House of Commons, Labour, the Liberal Democrats, the Scottish National Party, all were very strongly supporting the government's position, because it sends a very clear message to the Russians that they're not going to be able to find internal division in the United Kingdom in the way we deal with this threat from outside.
And Susan Kramer, that's quite an interesting one, isn't it? Because normally in any conflict, and I think back to Syria in 2013, when there was a real split within parties, between parties, as to whether the government, and there was the vote in the Commons which did not give the government permission to go ahead with military action against Assad in Syria. But here, there seems to be, I'm not going to say unanimity, but in your party, are you totally 100% behind what the government's doing?
I've not heard any voices that haven't been very strong. as we would say, sanctions at this point are not strong enough. Certainly from the UK, I think we've taken a very strong position. I mean, we have a history of looking at each situation on its own circumstance. I mean, we took a very different position over Iraq, that we didn't think that military action was the right action to take then. But then when you look at the positions that we talk about Croatia and Serbia, they were very much stronger positions than you would have seen from the other two parties. So it's a case of each individual situation.
I think we're all very Jeremy
clear.
Thorpe on Rhodesia as well, back in the 1960s. Bomber Thorpe.
That's, and don't we find that everybody suddenly finds they remember themselves being on the same side now? But we've always taken, I think, a firm position on this. And look, I mean, on the side, over the issues of economic sanctions, of dirty money in London, whatever, I'm one amongst many in my party who've been speaking out about this, not this week, not this month, but for years, and putting in amendments that would have created things like public registers of ownership of property, so you could see where the dirty money was coming in disguise through shell companies. We've argued those points, we've fought those points, and I'm in a battle with the government at the moment to make sure that in free ports, their new idea, the registers there are going to be public. We passed an amendment in the House of Lords just last week on that issue, and I hope the government's going to change its position and accept it.
Well, we might come on to the money side of this a little bit later. I can see at least one question on that. Jay, thank you for that. Let's move on to another question, which I want you to give fairly brief answers on, if you would. Robert is in Dulwich. Hello, Robert.
Good evening, everyone. So, in the interest of brevity, would we be in this situation if Donald Trump was in charge? There is a context there that's very brief.
Go on then.
Well, he warned us, he told us to get bigger armies and to increase our NATO funding. And he also told us a few years ago to stop buying Russian gas and giving Vladimir the money he needs to build his armies.
Okay. Mark Harper.
Well, the point about getting yourself to be less dependent on Russian oil and gas is a very sensible point, and we've been making that point here, and I think that's a very strong point. But I think we'd be in a much worse position if Donald Trump was still US president, because he wasn't very good at building alliances. He didn't work closely with his NATO partners and didn't try to bring them together. So actually, I think one of the things in this position, and I agree very strongly with what Peter said, is that actually NATO's been working very well here. We're the largest European NATO power. The US has been united. All of the NATO partners and our G7 colleagues have all been working very closely together. And looking at the history, that's not something I think that would have happened if Donald Trump was still in charge. So actually, it's good that we've got a much more collegiate process.
A lot of analysts think that Donald Trump's foreign policy was his biggest achievement, and that there are plenty of reasons to say that is true.
Well, I think the unpredictability argument I have heard made before, but I think the problem here is that you can only deal with a threat like Putin by sticking together and working with your allies. It's the fact that NATO is a partnership and all of the countries stick together and defend each other that makes it powerful, and that means you've got to have people willing to work together.
Susan.
Well, I mean, Trump was an America first. He didn't like NATO. He seemed to be inclined to remove America from NATO, or certainly to reduce its engagement in NATO. And he was very much focused on America not becoming entangled in other people's battles. I feel much safer with a Biden there, who takes, I think, the sort of pre-Trump position that has been consistent across American presidents very largely, which is the West holds together, the democracies hold together.
You could argue,
I think we see that reflected now.
You could argue that he had a relationship with Putin and he could have persuaded Putin not to do this. I'm not saying I do argue that, but you could.
You can make a lot of arguments like that, but remember that Trump always played first to the home crowd. And to that home crowd, keeping America out of troubles and out of battles, that would have been an absolute priority. He may say many things now because he's in a position where he wants to, as it were, become credible again to run again for president. But I am very certain that if he was sitting in the White House, we would be isolated in Europe trying to deal with the pressures that Russia was delivering to us.
Yeah, I don't believe the position would be better if Donald Trump was still the president. I think on the issue of the natural gas, I think whilst we in the United Kingdom have far less reliance than does our European partners, I do think there is a point to be made about gas storage, where I think we should have a better record in recent years. But on the issue of the position in international politics, I actually think President Biden's approach of bringing countries together is extremely important. And I think that's why I do agree with the point that we are in a better position with President Biden at this time.
Peter Ricketts, I wonder whether you regret standing down as National Security Advisor in 2012. I mean, you could have been in the job when Donald Trump was in power. Think how exciting that would have been.
I had an agonising choice to make between doing that or going to be ambassador in Paris.
I think you probably made the right one.
Just about on the balance, I decided Paris was the place to be. Yeah, I mean, sorry, this is a very boring series of answers because we're all saying the same thing. It would have been appalling if Donald Trump had still been president. Trump was under the sway, in a funny way, of President Putin. I don't think he had any useful influence over him, but he seemed to be very influenced by him. And he really did get across the European allies in NATO, particularly the Germans. He really, really didn't like the Germans. They didn't spend enough on defence, and they sent too many cars to America.
Which is odd, because he's, an eighth German or something, isn't he?
Too many German cars in America, it really got him up the wall. So, no, he was a very divisive figure within NATO, as Susan rightly says, and I think we would have been at sixes and sevens, frankly, and in America, because Trump was not in the same place as Congress on Russia at all. So even if President Putin thought he had an opportunity with Biden now so focused on China, I think actually Biden is a far better organizer and coordinator of the NATO alliance than Trump ever would have been.
Robert, I'm going to come back to you because I suspect you think that we wouldn't be in this situation if Trump was still in charge. 30 seconds to explain why.
Well, very simply, I mean, I'd like to inject some reality in the conversation and some facts. What I've just heard is precisely the attitude that we had 2 or 3 years ago when Trump was saying, build up NATO and stop arming your enemy. And I'm listening to people. It's not your children that, when this escalates, or if it does, that will be going to the front line. A country with a GDP the size of Italy's has just seized territory, and there's nothing we can do, because actually we lost this a few years ago because we didn't listen to Trump. And the idea that Trump is divisive when he was telling us to rally together and fund NATO and put more money into it, when I listen to the responses, there's this, we've had Brexit, we've had votes, the Red Wall, and I think we're going to keep on getting votes. Because the people I'm listening to tonight, and I live in London, I have a house in London, I'm meant to be part of the so-called liberal London elite, but I listen to you and I can't believe the danger that you're walking us into. Our country is stuffed full of free gas under our feet, and we've got some oil, we've got coal, and we don't use it because I suspect that the people around the panel don't agree. Will think we're going to die in 20 years.
We're getting slightly off the subject here, but I've given you a bit more than 30 seconds there to add a little bit of balance to the conversation. But thank you very much indeed for your call. We'll move on in a moment. It's 8:20.
This is LBC. Ask Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
23 minutes past 8. Nick, Thomas-Symonds, Mark Harper, Lord Ricketts and Baroness Kramer are with us taking your calls. Let's go to David in Enfield. Hi, David.
Good evening, panel. Something controversial. What's the point of the West having a nuclear deterrent if it doesn't consider using it in these sort of situations, at least using the threat of it in these situations?
That is such a difficult question to answer, and I'm glad I don't have to answer it, Nick Thomas-Symonds.
Well, the whole point, of course, of having a nuclear deterrent is to have it as the ultimate insurance policy. And for it to be successful, it is, of course, that it should not be used. It is meant to deter. That is the whole purpose of it. And listen, I faced this dilemma as a Member of Parliament back in 2016, and I chose to vote to renew our nuclear deterrent for that reason. I don't ever want to see it used. But it is important, of course, as well, alongside it, we need to be looking at disarmament around the world. Of course we do. But we do need that ultimate insurance policy, which is what it is, and that's why I did vote to renew it.
Peter.
Yes, a good answer. We have nuclear weapons, so we won't need to use them, because others, adversaries, have nuclear weapons, and if we and the Americans didn't, we would be at an enormous disadvantage under huge pressure if there was military action being applied by a country that had nuclear weapons and the West didn't. And it's not by coincidence, I think, that Americans and Russians have not come to war over the last 70 years, because both are nuclear powers, and the risks of that would be unbelievably serious for the planet as a whole. So it's difficult to get our minds around now. In the Cold War, I think people were used to thinking in these terms. Since the Cold War, people haven't thought very much about nuclear weapons, but the choice for the UK would be to say, well, we have it now. Is the world such a safe place that we can happily do away with it?
And there were people arguing that in the 1990s, weren't there? Saying, well, it's the end of the Cold War, we don't really need them now, we can get rid of them. And of course, Ukraine did get rid of its nuclear weapons.
Yes,
and
it did.
I doubt whether this crisis would be happening now if Ukraine had nuclear weapons.
And in return, they got an undertaking, including from Russia, that there were, their territorial integrity and sovereignty would be respected.
Yeah, that worked out well.
So that worked out well, yeah. Another reason to keep nuclear weapons.
Mark.
Well, at the risk of also violently agree with each other, I mean, my argument would be very similar to what Nick said. It's an insurance policy, and my argument is we actually use it every single day of the week, because having the nuclear deterrent means that we don't face a nuclear threat from a nuclear-armed hostile power, because they know we have a nuclear deterrent, and they know, and they can't ever be sure whether we would use it if they use nuclear weapons against us. So it's delivering the deterrence and that insurance policy every single day. So in that sense, we're getting our money's worth. We never actually want to press the button and launch the weapons, but having them keeps us safe from a nuclear armed enemy. And I very much agree with what Peter and Nick have said. It's helped keep us safe. And I certainly don't see a world in the foreseeable future where we could safely remove ours on a unilateral basis, certainly.
Susan, I always regard you as on the sensible wing of the Liberal Democrats. Are you going to join the consensus so far?
I'm going to say this because I think it's important. I think Ukraine is a real reminder to us that we need to seriously focus on denuclearizing the world. I can't do it unilaterally, but I do think that there absolutely needs to be a reinvigoration of trying to wind down nuclear arsenals. It's a long-term goal. But you look at the situation
Margaret
we have.
Thatcher always used to say you can't uninvent nuclear weapons,
well,
so therefore we need to keep them.
I still think you need to focus on this in a significant and meaningful way, because you can just look at the situation in Ukraine. And I think every one of us goes, certainly Putin is not crazy enough to go and use a nuclear weapon. But then there are those moments of doubt. I mean, we all listened to his press conference the other week, and last week, I mean, it seemed a very out of control, paranoid press conference. And there is a genuine, I think, argument that's both for negotiating far more serious than we've done historically, and also creating a framework so that other countries are not constantly tempted to acquire nuclear weapons.
You haven't quite answered the question there. What is the point of a nuclear deterrent if we're never going to use it?
Well, I mean, I think that is obvious. Your intention is never to use it. I don't disagree with that. But the problem is when you have one, somebody can press a button. You want to make that as difficult as possible. And I do think that re-engaging around those kinds of issues is something we need to do seriously. Okay. I think we stepped away from it after the Cold War because everybody said, well, we don't need them. They'll disappear gradually. It's all going to be beautiful in the
just
future.
A follow-up text from JCH, who says, would you rather live under Russia or post-nuclear war? It's almost a retro 1980s question. This one. Again, I'm not even sure that's possible to answer in some ways.
Neither, and I don't accept the premise of the question.
No.
Easy get out.
Post-nuclear war would be the planet devastated, actually. Yeah. Given the number of nuclear weapons and the power of them now, it would probably be the end of life on Earth. So I think we have to do everything.
So then the answer is we'd rather live under Russia.
Well, it's not a very attractive conclusion, but a nuclear war would be the worst of all outcomes.
Nick?
Well, of course, again, at the risk of furiously agreeing with what's been said,
it is allowed.
I do agree with both the answers that have been given.
Could I just add one word, that we are probably less safe in a way than we were in the Cold War, because a lot of the agreements that were there between the Soviet Union and America have lapsed on numbers of missiles, on the kind of weapons that can be deployed. One of the things we should be doing after the Ukraine crisis is getting back to some kind of framework, at least of limiting these weapons, even if it's not feasible in any foreseeable future to disinvent them.
David, thank you very much indeed for your question. We'll try and find a question where the panellists might disagree with each other in just a moment, but you never know. Right, let's go to the news headlines on LBC. It's 8:30. Here's Serena Farrow.
US President Joe Biden says he's directed his administration to impose sanctions on Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline in response to Russia's actions in Ukraine. It's understood Russia's military is as ready as they can be should they want to invade. Ukraine's expected to introduce new defence measures from midnight as well, including the conscription of men and fighting age. Politicians are also due to vote for a state of emergency in response to what it calls escalating Russian aggression. And the Duke of Sussex has started libel action at the High Court against the publisher of the Daily Mail. It's not known which of the Associated Newspapers' limited titles it relates to, as they also include the Mail on Sunday and Mail Online. LBC weather, that rain pushing south across England and Wales. Sleet, snow and hail showers further north with a low of -1 degree.
This is LBC. Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:33 on LBC. You're listening to Cross Question, or maybe watching on Global Player. With me in the studio are Nick Thomas-Symonds, the Shadow International Trade Secretary, Labour MP for Torfaen; Mark Harper, Conservative MP for the Forest of Dean and chair of the COVID Recovery Group of Conservative MPs; Lord Ricketts, Peter Ricketts, Crossbench peer, former National Security Advisor and UK Ambassador to France; and Baroness Susan Kramer, Lib Dem peer. I've got to ask you, Peter, as a former Ambassador to France, Putin humiliated Macron, didn't he?
I don't think so, actually. I don't think so, no. I mean, I think Macron will be left feeling that a lot of time was wasted. But I think it was fair enough to keep pushing diplomacy to the end of the line. He'd been talking to Putin, every week for the last 5 years. So had Merkel, by the way. And they tried their best. It didn't work out. But then our effort to deter Putin by arming the Ukrainians and threatening sanctions didn't work either. I think in France it will be seen as the natural role of a French president to have his own channel to Putin separate from the Americans. I don't think it'll have done him any harm.
But he did kind of emerge from that meeting at the long table, almost Neville Chamberlain-like, with a piece of paper in his hand saying peace in our time, and it just didn't turn out like that.
Well, it didn't. I mean, clearly Putin didn't follow through on whatever he thought he'd agreed there, and maybe Putin was just using it as a distraction, certainly. But it was worth doing, in my view.
Don't read my article in the Telegraph today, because you won't like it, given what you've just said. OK? Right, let's go to Christopher in South Wales. Christopher, hi, what would you like to ask?
Good evening, panel. Should
Hello.
politicians decide which broadcasters we, the public, listen to? Or should we be allowed to listen and decide for ourselves whether what we are hearing is propaganda, as we do with any broadcaster?
So you're talking about Russia Today, RT, and the fact that Nadine Dorries, the Culture Secretary, has written to Ofcom asking them to review whether they are observing the rules. Is there any harm in her doing that?
I don't think so, no. It does worry me that politicians try to influence Ofcom, perhaps. No problem in her asking it. I don't listen to Russia Today every day of the week. I don't want MI5 on my back. But listening to them, listening to their YouTube comment, I don't find, this is not Colonel Haw we're talking here, I don't find they're that much of propaganda. Indeed, I hear many British politicians of all persuasions on there.
Susan Kramer, have you ever been on it?
I have never been on it, and I'm afraid I've never listened to it either. I take the view that this is for Ofcom to decide, but if this is a propaganda channel, then we shouldn't be giving it a licence. I mean, they can use social media, they can use other ways if they want to talk to a particular community or express a particular set of views. But I don't think you give a licence to propaganda, and it would seem to me that that's the test that they've got to meet.
I mean, surely the liberal view of this would be to say, well, anyone can broadcast anything that they like.
No, I would be, if I heard people basically with a licence that were using it for extreme fascist views, if I heard people who were using it for racist views and whatever else, I would say it doesn't deserve a licence.
But surely it can be argued that Russia Today is just putting forward the view of the Kremlin, and it's perfectly harmless in terms of people then being able to make up their own minds.
I think it's a case that Ofcom has got to judge. I mean, it's not an easy thing. It takes a measure of judgment to decide, is this genuine news? Does it meet the impartiality test, which is a test for the licence, or is it propaganda? But if it is judged to be propaganda, then I don't see why we should be giving it a particular voice or platform.
OK, Peter?
My angle on this is that RT get far greater access to British people, to British opinion makers and to the British public than the BBC ever gets in Russia. And it's worth bearing that asymmetry in mind. If we could somehow use RT broadcasting in the UK as a lever to increase BBC coverage into the Russian public, I think that then would be interesting. But the fact is, this is a one-way street for the Russians to be able to pour their propaganda into Britain, whereas the BBC can't get its impartial news into Russia. Is that right? I'm uncomfortable about that. But I do think there's a genuine question, whether it serves any purpose to actually withdraw their licence, given that Russia have many, many other channels to get their views into the British public.
What about Christopher's question, though? Is it for politicians to decide which broadcasters we're allowed to listen to or watch?
Well, I think we're saying it's for Ofcom to decide, actually. I mean, there's a licensing regime, and it's Ofcom who decides whether you are respecting the licence or not.
Nick Thomas-Symonds, Keir Starmer has been very trenchant on this, firmly of the view that Russia Today should be closed down in this country. But going back to Christopher's question, is it really for him to make that kind of decision?
I think there is a distinction here between broadcasters that are seeking to follow the broadcasting code. We've got a very clear set of rules about that, which we expect our broadcasters to follow in order to have that privilege of being able to broadcast across the United Kingdom. Now, we actually asked as a party months and months ago for this issue of Russia Today to be referred to Ofcom. I do welcome the fact that the Prime Minister
doesn't need to be referred to Ofcom. Ofcom can look into what they like.
At the Prime Minister's questions today, Boris Johnson said that Nadine Dorries, the Culture Secretary, had done this as well. But I'm clear, and Labour is clear, there's a distinction between broadcasters that are actually seeking to follow the broadcasting code and those that are frankly just broadcasting misinformation. There's no moral equivalence between the two.
Mark?
Well, it's very clear. Politicians set the legal framework, so we pass the laws that govern how broadcasters have to operate, and to get a broadcasting licence, you have to follow the broadcasting code, as Nick has said, and Ofcom's job is to police whether you're following it. So it was right for the Culture Secretary to draw that to Ofcom's attention. I understand Ofcom, I think I saw their reply this afternoon, which is they have said they keep this under close review, what RT is broadcasting. I think they've reminded RT of the requirements of the broadcasting code, but it's for Ofcom then to judge if RT are following the code. If they don't follow the code, then Ofcom can take their licence away.
Which they did to a Chinese station. Was it CGTN, I think?
I think so, but they're independent in terms of implementing the legal framework that politicians have implemented. It shouldn't be for individual politicians to switch on and off individual broadcasters. That would clearly be wrong.
I sometimes wonder what the point of being a politician is if you can't do that sort of thing. Christopher, a quick response from you.
I would just suggest everybody reads the South Wales Echo, purely factual. As I hope Nick would agree with me.
Very good.
Absolutely. South Wales Echo, South Wales Argus to be recommended.
Can I tell you that in April we're going to be broadcasting this programme from South Wales? So I hope you won't want us banned, Christopher.
No, not at all. Thanks for your time, gents.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Saved yourself there, just. Right, let's move on and take a text from Olivia in Sheffield. Should Keir Starmer follow the Prime Minister's suggestion and remove the whip from those Labour MPs who call NATO the aggressor? We've kind of already had an answer from Nick on that one. I don't know if you want to expand on this one.
All I do want to say about this, and I've already said I don't think it's appropriate for me to comment on the process of removal of the whip, but our position, Labour's position, is profoundly different. NATO is a defensive alliance. It is completely wrong to suggest...
What about Libya? What about Afghanistan? There are some examples that the Stop the War Coalition quote to prove the opposite.
Well, the issue, and I always think with these, how difficult these particular military interventions are. I think you have to judge each individual one on their own facts. But the position is this: if sovereign nations wish to aspire to join NATO, that is a matter for the sovereign nation. And nations that choose voluntarily and want to join NATO should be welcomed. That is actually their democracy,
but
their
of course,
choice in action.
You campaigned for Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister. If he were Prime Minister now, I think we all know that the British government policy would be somewhat different to the one that we're following.
I've campaigned for Labour to win in every general election in my adult life, and in every one of those general elections, the Labour manifesto that I campaigned on supported NATO. And I was very clear as well, by the way, at the time, when March 2018, with the Skripal poisonings, I opened the debate in the House of Commons for that. And I specifically said in the debate that what the Prime Minister had then, Theresa May, had said about her assessment of who was responsible, that I absolutely agreed with that, and I was very clear.
What a pity your leader didn't.
No. In contrast, Keir Starmer that week, in fact...
No, I'm talking about Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, the party policy on NATO never changed.
No, I know, but he would have been Prime Minister and would have presumably tried to have a very different policy reacting to Ukraine than the one that the current British government is conducting and the one that you're supporting.
Well, we'll never know that precisely, but the manifesto I stood on was very clear about support for
Did you breathe a sigh of relief, though, on the night after the election that he hadn't become Prime Minister?
I've never, on every general election, every local election I've campaigned, and I've always campaigned to try to win that election.
OK. Susan?
I don't think this is territory on which a different political party should venture. I think this is for the Labour Party.
I'm sure Mark won't be able to resist.
Well, Mark may not be able to, but I really think there are some occasions when this is an internal issue and this is something that basically the Labour Party must decide for itself.
Mark, it's a bit rich for the Prime Minister to suggest removing the whip from MPs who just happen to have a different policy position, isn't it?
Well, my view is he's right in the sense...
You would have had the whip withdrawn from...
Well, I was just going to say, I don't think taking the whip away from people just because they disagree with you. We live in a democracy. I'd much rather have a debate with them. And frankly, that all of the Labour MPs that he's referring to, no, not all Labour MPs, of course. Jeremy Corbyn isn't a Labour MP at the moment. He had the whip taken away because he of his lack of dealing with anti-Semitism.
Don't think he's going to get it back after all of this.
And Claudia Webb, the other MP, has had it taken away because she's been convicted of serious criminal offence.
She's appealing, we should say.
So... but she has still been convicted of a criminal offence.
Yes,
the point is, Stop the War movement, or Stop the West, as I prefer to call them, and the Labour MPs who support them are just fundamentally wrong. They've been wrong on these issues for many years. And the Jeremy Corbyn point, I mean, I think your assessment, Iain, of what would have happened if he'd become Prime Minister is right. I think the British public shared that assessment, which is why it so resoundingly rejected him. My constituency, I had Labour members of the Labour Party, who were torn between abstaining or voting for me, because the one thing they were very clear about, because they were patriotic people, was that they didn't want Jeremy Corbyn anywhere near Downing Street, and they took the measures necessary to make sure he came nowhere near it.
Peter, I suspect you're going to plead the fifth on this one.
I'm going to plead the crossbench members of the House of Lords don't have a whip. So that makes life a bit easier for us. But I think Putin has done a great deal to support NATO, increase support for NATO across NATO countries, actually. So he's a good recruiting sergeant for NATO.
I'm going to let you get away with that non-answer to the question. It's 8:46.
This is LBC.
I didn't
Ask Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:49, Nick Thomas-Symonds, Mark Harper, Peter Ricketts and Susan Kramer with us taking your calls and questions. Lots of text tonight. You can text, of course, on 84850, which is what Caroline in Vauxhall has done. Is it appropriate for the Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, to compare the end of COVID regulations to putting a serial killer on the front bench? Now, just to provide a bit of context to this one, while the Prime Minister was answering questions in the House of Commons on Monday, Wes Streeting heckled, "Personal responsibility, what next? Harold Shipman on the front bench." And today he's apologised for that, saying it was an inappropriate comment. Mark Harper, there's always a bit of banter and heckling going on. I mean, should we get very excited about this?
Well, I think the thing that he's done, which I saw the Twitter exchange earlier, he's apologised for it because he said it was a tasteless reference. I don't think, making jokes about Harold Shipman is appropriate. He had several hundred victims. But Wes has done the right thing because he's apologised swiftly for having made that inappropriate comparison. So, I think that's what politicians should do when they make mistakes. They should apologise for them.
Never happens on the crossbenches in the House of Lords, does it, Peter?
Now, I feel really uncomfortable with the tone that I hear down the hall in the other place sometimes. The trading of insults and innuendos, the references to Jimmy Savile not that many days ago as well. I really do think that people would appreciate if politics became a little bit less brutal and vicious and a bit more statesmanlike, and people respected each other. And I think that probably applies on all the benches there, not so much in the House of Lords. We don't get all that much.
No, but most of the peers in the House of Lords are ex-politicians. So why is it that the House of Lords is so much more docile?
There's an awful lot of us who have never been politicians and who try and keep them on the straight and narrow.
If you say so. Nick Thomas-Symonds, have you ever been involved in one of these situations where you've heckled and then subsequently thought, ooh, maybe that was a little bit too far?
No, I've always been robust in the House of Commons. I've had robust exchanges with Mark during the pandemic many times over the years, and I think that it is important that the Commons is a place of robust debate. I think that is the way that we hold ministers properly to account, which after all is the role of Parliament. But there are times when people do cross the line. I think great credit to Wes for apologising very quickly. He hasn't allowed this to run over. He's been very clear that that was a tasteless thing. He's apologised, and I think when politicians do that, it's to be praised.
That's the second time you've used the word clear last night. I kept pulling up a Conservative MP last night saying we've been very clear, because whenever I hear a politician say, oh, there's a text on this, apparently, where is it? I can't see it. It says... This is from Den in Lincoln. I'm sick of hearing politicians telling us how clear they are. If they get any clearer, they'll be transparent.
I will make a personal promise here, and I will not use the word clear for the rest of the show.
Now, Susan, you're not a shy and retiring violet, are you, in debate? You like a bit of robust...
I'm going to really challenge the description of the House of Lords as docile.
Did you say docile?
No, you didn't, but Iain here did. I have to say...
Comparatively, it is.
Well, no, it's not docile, though. It's really tough. Because so often when people speak in the House of Lords, they really know their subject. I mean, you only speak in your expert area. You don't do the man in the pub thing that basically a lot of MPs have to do and know Well, MPs are called on to know everything about everything. We're not in the House of Lords. And it's really serious stuff. And when you get someone attempting to be either patronising or insulting or whatever else, the entire House hisses. I mean, it is pretty devastating. There are a couple of ministers who've learned some very hard lessons about trying to use the clever put down. I've never been hissed. Would I be hissed, Iain? Would you hiss me?
No, because I wouldn't dare. Simple as that. Well, there we are. Thank you very much for your answers on that one. Denise is in Portsmouth and she has texted, you've probably all heard about the concerning new plans around denying student loans depending on GCSE results. Is this levelling up? I've rarely heard of a more stupid policy announcement, Mark Harper.
Well, there hasn't been a policy announcement yet. I think it was
an official government proposal.
No, I think I'm right in saying the Secretary of State for Education is going to make a statement to Parliament tomorrow.
And what would you urge the Secretary of State to say?
Well, I don't think there should be a hard and fast rule, because I think one of the things I'm very keen to do is make sure people have opportunities from whatever background they have through the whole of their life. And I'm very clear that some people...
Very clear.
I'm going to stick with very clear. I'm very clear that there are people who don't have a good start in life, have difficult things to cope with at school, maybe fail exams, don't do very well, and I would want them still to have an opportunity later in life, perhaps, to go and get into higher education and to get the opportunities perhaps they didn't have at the beginning. So if this came forward in
legislation, you would vote against it?
Well, we haven't even heard the announcement yet, so I'll listen to what the Secretary of State says tomorrow. I would urge the Secretary of State to make sure that we maximise the opportunities available to people, whatever their start in life, however difficult it is, so that we give everyone the opportunity to reach their full potential. That's what I'm a Conservative for.
Normally, when a government makes a policy announcement, even though we don't know exactly what it is, according to Mark tomorrow, you sort of hear it and you think, well, I can see there must be, even if I don't agree with it, I can see the logic of it. I can't imagine what the argument for this is, and I can't imagine that you do either, Nick, but try.
Well, I think that's for the government, if that's genuinely what they want to announce, to justify. But I really worry about a hard and fast rule like that. And as a constituency member of Parliament, I've made representations on so many occasions about student finance where people have ended up with very particular circumstances where they, for example, they've gone away, they've come back, they've developed at a different age. And I think to do that really would not be in any sense giving people a fair opportunity.
The only justification that I've heard for it so far is that it's meant to stop people from doing so-called Mickey Mouse degrees. Well, that indicates that anybody with, shall we say, a lower educational achievement is going to automatically go and do a Mickey Mouse degree, which is insulting and condescending anyway. But that is the only argument that people have put forward so far.
I have an exact story. So when I was an MP, I went out batting for a young woman. She was clearly terrific, who had been denied a nursing place because she struggled with the maths GCSE. 2 weeks ago, I was in Kingston Hospital. One of her colleagues came to me and said, "My friend asked me to come over to you. She's now the senior nurse on this ward." She was so good but she struggled with trying to deliver on that GCSE paper for maths.
Well, now, of course, you have to have a degree to be a nurse.
Well, but the point that I'm making, I think, is a really serious one. We have this narrow vision of what ability is, and it's time that we dumped it. And if you don't like Mickey Mouse courses, challenge the Mickey Mouse courses. Right. Not people.
Peter.
I went to university 50 years ago, I have to say, and it's one of the great achievements, I think, of our society in that time, that there's far greater access now to higher education for people of all kinds and sorts and different ability levels. I think that we really mustn't put that at risk, and the government oughtn't to be regulating this down as finely as that, it seems to me, where people are so diverse.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what the actual announcement says tomorrow. I suspect we might be covering it on the programme tomorrow night. Right, our fun question for the end, which everyone always looks forward to. Jerry in Bakewell says, the Bank of England chief, Andrew Bailey, has admitted he can't remember how much he's paid. It's over 500,000 if you're listening, Andrew. What's the worst thing that you've forgotten? You're going to say, I can't remember, aren't you? Nick?
Well, I shouldn't admit this on air, as I will get a row for this when I go home tonight, but I did manage 1 year to nearly forget my wedding anniversary.
Nearly forget?
Nearly, but really someone else reminded me and saved me.
And Esso were open. Susan?
I introduced my son Jonathan to someone as my daughter Abigail.
I don't know what to say to that. Well, of course, in these days of gender fluidity,
neither of them happen to be a he/she. Be perfectly fine if they were, but oh dear.
Mark.
Sorry, what was the question?
Very good. Is that your answer?
That's my answer. Yeah.
Okay. At least you're clear about that. Peter.
Yeah, I think my advice would be don't forget your wife's birthday, because that's even worse than forgetting the wedding anniversary, and that's a high risk.
Good advice, Peter.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a really good edition of Cross Question. I've really enjoyed it. Hope everyone at home has too. Lord Ricketts, Mark Harper, Baroness Kramer and Nick Thomas-Symonds, thank you very much for joining us over the last hour. Well, coming up in the next hour, we are going to talk about Boris Johnson's assertion that we just covered a moment ago, actually, that the 13 Labour MPs who signed the Stop the War coalition statement about basically opposing NATO and saying it's all down to NATO expansionism. Boris Johnson has suggested that the whip should be withdrawn from those MPs by Keir Starmer.